Can you hear me?
Yes. What did she say?
It's not there. That's really what she said.
People on the loop?
It's my enormous pleasure, I have to say, to introduce Keith Ward. He's been a friend for many, many years, since our paths met in the cathedral, at which time he was Regius Professor of Divinity. He can talk about anything, actually. Well, no, not railways. He said, not railways. He's a theologian, obviously, and a philosopher, an ethicist, and I've heard him talk on a huge range of subjects, all of which were interesting. So I'm really glad you're here, because I know you will be pleased to be here. This is the last Thursday lunchtime talk that I'm doing. That's what I've said. I know I've said it before, but this is it. Although I will just say right now, on the 29th of September, which is 2 Thursdays before full term, a Jesuit priest is coming here to give a talk on the Pope's concept of mercy to art. He will be illustrating his talk. I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating, so please come. I will propose to set nearer the time. But anyhow, welcome to St. Giles, and welcome to Keith, and here you are.
Well, I think the title of this talk that I gave many weeks or even months ago was The Path to Theosis. I can't remember what I meant by that. But of course, Theosis is something perhaps has been talked about in this series so far. It is union with God, and the word apotheosis is often translated as divinization. And it's very characteristic of Eastern Christian churches. And it comes really from the second book, a letter of Peter, chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, which go like this. God's divine power has given us everything needed for life and godliness, and through God's promises you may escape from the corruption that is in the world, and you may become participants in the divine nature. And that's theosis. You may become participants in the divine nature. I think I should warn you that I learned Greek in a school with very English pronunciation of Greek, and I can't stop using it. So anything that Callistos said is correct in pronunciation. But I'm going to talk about koinonia. And I know something like koinonia. Anyway, koinonia is fellowship or participation. That's the word that's used in this text. And what's meant by sharing in the divine nature? Now, I'm going to try to put together two aspects that I'm interested in religion, and one is Christian, of course, and the other belongs to a school known as Vishishta Advaita Vedanta. And that is the school of Ramanuja, and it translates roughly into English as qualified non-dualism. Anyway, whatever it is, it's an Indian sort of spirituality, and I think it's very close to the ideas of divine participation, which were worked out largely or partly by the Cappadocian fathers in the 4th century. Now, I think, of course, what one is concerned with as a Christian is, above all, living in relation to, or even as part of, the Trinity, participating in the Trinitarian life of God. So I have to think a little bit about the Trinitarian life of God. Well, of course, we know what the words are for our understanding of the Trinity: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We also know that things can very quickly get a lot more complicated than that in the theological tradition, although it remains basically simple. And I want to go for a simple view of the Trinity, really, but to say that there are developments in modern theology which may cause many of us to rethink the way it has been put in the past, not rejecting it, but maybe reformulating it. One of the ways that people like me want to reformulate it is to say that the word person, when people talk about three persons in one God, is no longer communicative of anything that is essential to the doctrine, because there's a word which I prefer, which Karl Barth in the Reformed tradition prefers, and which Karl Rahner in the Catholic tradition prefers, and which John Corrie in the Anglican tradition prefers, and so I think I'm in good company in preferring it, and that is to replace the word person by the word mode of being, Seinsweisen in German, a mode of being or an aspect of being, and to say that we can think as Christians of God as a being who exists in three ways or three modes of being. And I think I find that more helpful than to say there are three persons in God. However, let me just say that there is a big division between theologians in the modern world about this. There's everybody else and then there's me. The everybody else is mostly, if I choose two names here, Jürgen Moltmann and in this university, a very close colleague of mine, Richard Swinburne. And they want to stick to the word person with regard to the Trinitarian being of God. Well, the reason I'm talking about this is because if we want to participate in the being of God, we want to have some idea of what the being of God is and what it means to participate in it. And the view that people like Swinburne, and also John Zizioulas in the Orthodox tradition, and most markedly Jürgen Moltmann, but it's a fairly popular interpretation, is known as the social interpretation of the Trinity. And that takes the word person very similarly to the way in which we may use it of human persons, namely a centre of consciousness. And the way it comes out is this. In the first letter of John, chapter 4, verse 8, it says, something that we all know, God is love. And the word used for love is agape, God is love. And if God is love, so the social Trinitarians say, then there must, within the being itself of God, be something like love. And love is essentially relational. It's between persons, and so there must be something in the being of God which is like a relation of persons. Partly, Augustine uses one analogy, like this in his rather large book on the Trinity, and what he says is, well, there is one who loves, the Father, there is one who is loved, the Son, and there is love itself, which binds them together, the Spirit. So there you've got a threefold division, and you think of love as between them. The Father gives to the Son all that he is and has, the Son receives it and returns it, so you have a giving and receiving within the being of God itself. Now, I find this a very moving image, and the thought that God has that internal sort of loving relationship you find reproduced in many, many sermons about the Trinity. So I don't just want to contradict it, I just want to say that it's wrong. It's an image, of course, and when we're talking about the Trinitarian being of God, we're talking about images that are helpful to us. And they've got to be based on Scripture, and they've got to be based on tradition too, but when we look at Scripture and tradition, we find there are many different ways of interpreting it. There's not just one given way. And that way of thinking of three persons in loving union, although it's nice to think about love existing like that, doesn't really seem to fit with what Jesus said. When Jesus said, according to Mark's Gospel, that the Lord our God is one Lord, monotheism. Jürgen Moltmann takes his objection to monotheism so far that he thinks monotheism is not Christian at all, and that you have to believe in three persons in God. Then my hackles begin to rise, and I think surely we do believe in one God. So there's another way of looking at the Trinity which preserves that thought of one God, often thinks, well, you can think of the one God in three modes of being, three different ways of being, but they're being the same God. And if you look back in patristic thought, you find this strain of thought is there as well. In the East, in Golden Missa, as well as in the West, sometimes people try to split the East and the West, but actually the split doesn't lie between East and West. It lies between people who are moved by the image of love within the being of God, and people who are more moved by the thought there is only one will and one mind in God, and that God is one and is the creator of everything other than God that exists. And there is only one will that God has. There is only one creator of the universe, and that is God. And that's the tradition I would like to preserve. I'm not alone. I think that's an equally major tradition of thinking about the Trinity, and it's one I want to spell out a little bit. So, in that way of thinking, the most obvious way to start is to say, well, when you speak about God as Father, first of all, we have to think these are very earth-bound metaphors. Father, Son, and Spirit, which is breath or air, are very this planetary concept. Well, we do live on this planet after all, so that is not a silly thing to say, but isn't God the God of the whole universe? And isn't it rather likely, well, it's at least possible, that there are millions and millions of other planets in a universe in which there are millions and millions of other galaxies, and billions of other stars, and billions upon billions of other planets? I think it would be rather sad if they were all empty of intelligent life. Now, I can't guarantee there is intelligent life somewhere else, although the Americans spend a lot of money to try and find it. And I do think it would be rather nice if God had created other intelligent forms. And other intelligent life forms must surely believe in a Trinitarian God too, because that's what God is, Trinitarian. But they can't believe in a God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, I think it's very dubious. If there is life on other worlds, it's very doubtful that they will have male and female chromosomes. It's very unlikely they'll be divided into two sexes. Why should they be? And it's very unlikely that they will breathe oxygen. So the metaphors of father, a male member of a species in which there are two sexes mainly, and a son, who is of course the offspring of that male, but is again a male gendered person, and a spirit, which is really air, which would only make sense to people who have air, who breathe oxygen. So what I want to say is those metaphors are correct for us. They're not incorrect. We are correct to think of God in that way, but they're not cosmically universal. There must be something deeper lying underneath those metaphors. And fortunately, there is, of course. And you find this deeper meaning in lots of modern liturgies, for example, when God, as Trinity, is referred to as the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sanctifier, or in several ways. I use John Macquarie's way of expressing this in a classic book, which is rather too neglected these days, called The Principles of Christian Theology. And John Macquarie talks about the primordial being of God, the expressive being of God, and the unitive being of God. And those are the three aspects of the divine being which are Trinitarian, but they don't as such mention Father, Son, or Spirit, and they could in fact take other forms in our worlds, if there are any, or in worlds which don't have sexual or gendered roles and which don't have oxygen-breathing animals on them. You use other things. Just think of the way in which it was very difficult at the first missionaries who went to preach to the Inuit in the undevised snow, and they had to talk about feed my sheep. Well, none of the Inuit had ever seen a sheep, and one of the first biblical translations was feed my penguins. You know, that has a different ring to it, doesn't it? But it makes the point that the words you use might be very localized to you, and you may need to find other ways of putting the point you want to make. So what I'm saying is Father, Son, and Spirit is right for us, it's very important. And that Christian spirituality, we're talking about meditation in this series, I know, meditation is really life in. I'm within somehow the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. It's living in union with the Father, devotion to the Son, and mediation of the Spirit. Gregory of Nyssa put it like this, that every act, everything that God does, proceeds from the Father through the Son, it is affected by the Son, and it is completed by the Spirit. And that's the way I think we'll think of it. You're not thinking of three people having a loving relationship. You're thinking of every act that God does as proceeding from the primordial origin and source, which is beyond every finite universe, but as being affected or imaged or expressed in finite forms of life, and on this planet in a human form for us, the form of Jesus, and as being completed, the actions of God are completed by the Spirit, which unites that finite reality to the divine reality, and that is Theosis. So that's an interpretation of the Trinity, which says Father, Son, and Spirit is right. We've got to explore that a bit more, but we're thinking about the primordial aspect of God, an aspect which is beyond our understanding. We can say that there is such a thing, but we can't hope to know what it is like to be such a thing. So in what sense could we participate in the nature of the Father? And I think that would be what you might call the mystical sense, the sense of union, which is a sense of being beyond any finite category that you could apply. The sense of having passed beyond language to something which you might still call knowledge. It's acquaintance, but it's not formulatable in concepts. And we all have an idea of what such a thing is, because if you're acquainted with another person, you may say, well, I'm acquainted with them, I've met them, I know things about them, but you certainly couldn't describe much about them, and there'd be whole aspects of their lives that you knew nothing about. So acquaintance is possible, although you know little by description of a person. You can give some descriptions, but they might be very inadequate and incomplete. And if we're thinking of God in the primordial aspect of the abyss of being from which all other things spring, it's hardly surprising that we can't have any concepts which would be adequate to that, because that being from which all concepts spring is beyond all concepts. But it is still possible, perhaps, to have a sense of union, of acquaintance with that reality. Because it's beyond concepts, it would be very difficult to say whether this union was an absolute union, becoming one, becoming identical, or whether it was rather a relationship. Again, Christianity is often split into two different ways of interpreting this. Some Christians have wanted to say, perhaps a bit like Teresa in some moods about, I know, has been talked about, and in that mood you may say, well, we pass into a stage where we can no longer tell the difference between myself and the divine being, and they seem, as it were, like drops into the ocean, and you merge into that ocean. But then Teresa at other times, of course, is very concerned with a loving relationship with God, and love implies difference and otherness. So we have to find a way between identity and otherness. And of course, we can think of such a way, but not conceptually. That is, we can't imagine, we can't know what it's like. But it might be possible to experience it, and this would be one of the aims, I think, of a Christian life, that we might want some sort of acquaintance with a reality which we could no longer describe in concepts, but we got to that experience through using concepts. In our case, through talking about the Father of Jesus. That would be a way of beginning to say, well, the source of all being, but imaged somehow, in some way, in the person of Jesus. But when you get to it, when you become acquainted with that being itself, with the primordial aspect of the divine nature, you have to say this is hidden in a cloud of unknowing. Unknowing, descriptively, but known by acquaintance. So that sense of acquaintance has to be obtained by passing through thought, but going beyond it. And that's part of the Christian way, and it's part, of course, of what God is. But here, Christianity has a very distinctive thing to say about relationship to God, and that is that God is not just the primordial creator who, as it were, stands apart from and over against the universe, perhaps. God is also, in the Incarnation, one who enters into the finite, who can and does express the divine being in finite things, in lots of finite things. Remember, John's Gospel says Jesus is the light that lightens everyone who is born into the world. And remember that the expression the world, cosmos, the world in John, is a bad place. It's a corrupt place, at least. It's a place in which there is corruption. And yet John also says Christ is the light which lightens every person who lives in this world. There is not only corruption or darkness, there is also light. And you know what John says about judgment. Judgment is that the light came into the world and people prefer darkness to light. But as Gregory of Nyssa would say, not ever. But still, it's a possibility of human life. But if Christ is the universal light, then when Christ says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he's talking about a way for everyone, a universal way, with which people are partly acquainted wherever they are and whatever they think, and even if they don't know, theoretically, what it is that they're acquainted with. Raman Panakar was a Catholic priest who was also a Buddhist, also a Hindu. He was a very confusing person. Raman Panakar used to say that, well, he wrote a big book, in fact, a very big book, called The Unknown Christ of Hinduism. And that makes the point, in a way, that Christ, who is the light of the world, must be known, but not identified for what Christ truly is. And I think that's the only way Christians can think of the love of God. The love of God is everywhere. God's grace is everywhere. It precedes every human life and every human thought, but it's not identified for what it is. So God can be expressed in lots of different ways, in the beauty of art, the beauty of nature, the wisdom of science, and the demands of morality. All these could be expressions of divine nature. But of course, for Christians, the person of Jesus shows something distinctive about the being of God, and that is precisely that God is agape. Agape being self-giving love. And if that's what Christ expresses of God, then Christ is the expression of self-giving love. And in relation to Christ, we can have a slightly different relationship than to the primordial Father. That is to say, Christ relates to us as what we might call a brother, a child of God, someone who has the same nature that we have, but is also the expression of the eternal word or wisdom of God. In the beginning, John's Gospel says, was the Logos, the word or reason or wisdom of God, or the thought of God, possibly. And that eternal word, of course, being eternal, precedes the life of Jesus, the man. But it also filled, in a unique way, the life of Jesus, the man. And we, as Christians, believe that that humanity of Christ will always, from the conception of Jesus himself to the end of time, be united in a very close, uniquely close way to the divine being itself. And I would have thought at this point you have to say, this is not, although it was unique in Jesus in his earthly life, it's not going to be unique to Jesus forever, because that is the destiny for each one of us. And that's theosis. Theosis would be a complete identification with a transcendent reality of God. And we have to say, well, we're nowhere near that now. You may sometimes think you are, but you're not really. So you can't say, I am God. I mean, I know some Hindus rather misleadingly say they're God, but actually they're just exaggerating a bit. And what you really want to say is, well, maybe that's my destiny. Maybe my destiny is to be fully united with God. If I was fully united with God, what would it be like? I would have a clear and an intense knowledge of the presence of God. My acquaintance would be deep and lasting and maybe unbreakable. And also, God would be able to act through me, through my mind and through my actions, so that I would express what God is like. That is our destiny, but it's something which, in Christian belief, Jesus actually expressed in his human life. Jesus was one who knew the Father in an intimate and deep way, and to express the love of God fully in his life in a way that we don't. He was like us, but without sin, that is to say, without all the things that prevent us from being actually united to God. So the Incarnation becomes a very important part of Christian spirituality, because what it says is that God is not just apart from us. God is not just the transcendent creator of all things. God is one who becomes one with us. There's a word for that in the New Testament too. It's only used once, but it's the word kenosis, a word much loved by Lutheran theologians. And the word kenosis means that God empties the divine being of all but love. And I suppose you could see the Incarnation as that in the person of Jesus you don't see power, you don't see omniscience. Jesus was human, he had a human brain, it couldn't contain all the information about Einstein's theory of relativity. If it had done, he could have told somebody. So Jesus was a limited human being as a human person, but also that human person had a unique unity with the divine. So there's a union possible between the divine and the human. A union such that, well, you're never going to be omnipotent and omniscient. So your union with God is not going to be like that. You're not going to have every property that God has. But then think of the way that parts of your body are parts of you. You may say, well, my hand is part of me, but it's not as intelligent as I am, for example. So it doesn't have all the properties that I have as a whole person. Well, in somewhat the same way, you may say we are parts of the body of God. In fact, Christians do say that, though they don't often remember it. We say that as Christians when we say that we are the body of Christ, because we do believe that Christ is the eternal Word of God. Therefore, in strict logic, we are parts of the body of the eternal Word of God. So we are parts of God. That shouldn't be a shock to any Christian. It's there again and again in the New Testament. We are parts of God. And that's the distinctive thing about this part of Christian spirituality. We're not over against God, just there's an aspect of God in which we are. God is infinite, the most powerful being there could possibly be, the most wise and knowing being there could possibly be. We're never going to be that, we're never going to have those properties, but nevertheless we are parts of that being. In an appropriate way, we're not over against it, we are one with it. And that's what the Incarnation is, the kenosis of God, the self-giving of God, overflowing and expressing itself into the world, means that God could be united to human nature. In Jesus, Christians believe God was fully united to human nature and always will be. For us, well, that is yet to come, but it's something we grow towards. That's why I call this talk The Path to Theosis, because I think that's what Christian life really is. It's beginning on the way to achieving unity with God, close and intense knowledge, acquaintance with the presence of God, and full and unlimited mediation of God's love. It's a long way off, but it's there as a hope which Christ foreshadows. The word prolepsis is another good Greek word. Jesus is the prolepsis of humanity. A prolepsis is a future event described as though it is present, or a future event foreshadowed in the present. So you could say Jesus is the prolepsis. He is the foreshadowing of the destiny of all human beings. And maybe more than all human beings. You know by now that I like the thought of extraterrestrial beings, so maybe Christ is the one through whom all extraterrestrials, all intelligent beings, even perhaps a lot of unintelligent beings, will be united to the divine. So there are two aspects of God, the primordial aspect, the transcendent God, with which we can have acquaintance but not conceptual knowledge. There is the expressed being of God, expressed in many ways, but particularly for us in the person of Jesus, with whom, or in relation to whom, in devotional relation to whom, we can, as it were, relate to God as if to another person, or at least to another person who is a person fully united to God, so that that person mediates the being of God fully. And, as Augustine said, what you see and contemplate, you become. What Augustine had in mind was, if you contemplate Christ, you become like Christ. He becomes the image which shapes your life in the world. And the third aspect, well, that's the spirit, of course. And I suggest again, John Curry's word is very helpful, the unitive aspect of the divine nature. That just as God expresses the divine being in creation, so the fulfillment of that expression is not that it remains as an expression, which in a way is distinct from God, a part of God, but it has a distinctness there. It has to be united fully to the divine being. If that's true, the whole universe, in a sense, is due to be to experience an apotheosis, a divinization, a full uniting to God. And if that occurs, of course, then at that point there will be no pain, no suffering, no failure, but also no continuing journey of the same sort, no discipline, no difficulties to overcome, no community with other forms of life and other people who are perhaps difficult to get on with, but pose a moral challenge to us that causes us to grow too. And that would be perhaps a life with the eternal. And the way that the Spirit is known to the Christian world is as the power of God within human lives. So it's not God totally other, transcendent. It's not God expressed in things that we can relate to, like the person of Jesus. It is God within. It is the divine breath of God transfiguring our lives to be more like images of God. So that is a picture of the Christian life which has a threefold sort of orientation. And this is where I might make a little connection with Hindu thought. Because perhaps you know that in Hindu thought there are three major ways of relation to the divine. Three forms of yoga in a sense of relation to the divine. One of those ways is the way of contemplation. And that of course relates to the primordial aspect of the divine being, which is non-conceptual. And it is a form of acquaintance. And in that way, you cannot distinguish between the one and the other. And then there is the way of devotion, bhakti yoga. And the way of devotion is that you are devoted, often in the Hindu tradition, to Krishna, for example. But in the Christian tradition, it would be to the person of Jesus. And that relation of devotion is a relationship of love and desire to an expression, an image of the divine being. Paul used the expression which he got from Plato, that Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God. Plato didn't talk about Jesus, of course, but it was his expression. And then there is the way in Hindu spirituality too of karma yoga, that is the way of works or activity. And in that way, a Christian would say, yes, the way we have to live is to allow the Spirit to live in and through us. And that is the way it works. That must be, you can't just sit around contemplating all the time. You have to do something You have to show love in practical ways. And you have to do this not by doing your best to love, but by doing your best to let the Spirit of God love in and through you. So there's quite a remarkable resemblance between the Christian view of Father, Son and Spirit, primordial, expressive and unitive, and Hindu traditions of three different traditions of relation to God. You have to say these are not just contradictory ways, they're complementary. They can and they should all live together. Of course, this way of looking at it essentially involves the thought of life beyond this life, because if you're talking about life in the world, this doesn't happen. It happens a little bit, perhaps, in us, we hope. But in most of the world, it doesn't happen at all. Now, one thing you could do about that is just condemn the world. Some Christians are tempted to do that, saying that they've all had it. But on the other hand, didn't Christ come to redeem the world? This is the Lamb of God that takes away the sin, not of me and you, but of the world, the whole thing. And so there's another nice Greek word for you here, some of you will know, but not many of you could say, and I don't think I can say it either, but I'll do my best to try. Apokotastasis. Apokotastasis. Right, thank you. Apokotastasis, on which one of my graduate students once wrote a PhD, so I want to remember the word really. But it means the regeneration, or actually it's usually interpreted to mean the salvation of everything. Let's just interpret it that way. All things get saved. Now, if this is too shocking, don't worry, you don't have to believe it. But it's a nice thing to believe. You believe that if God is utter love, and there is never any state or condition of anyone where love is not possible, where divine love is impossible. Even the Psalm says, if I make my bed in Sheol, in the world of the dead, God is there too. And John's Gospel says, now, the time is now, and is to come, when the dead hear the voice of Christ. And you know that in the letters of Peter, there is that remarkable statement that when Christ descended into Sheol, which we use the misleading word hell for, when Christ descended to the world of the dead after his crucifixion, he preached, and I quote, he preached to the spirits in prison, so that they, although they had died in the flesh like men, they would live in the spirit like gods. That's Theosis again, they would live like gods. And these were the bad lot. If you ask who were they to whom Christ preached, I've got an icon in my house, a very beautiful icon, I'm very pleased with indeed, of the harrowing of hell. And then the harrowing of hell, Christ is, after the crucifixion, bringing out Adam and Eve from hell. And the harrowing of hell came to be thought of in medieval times as all the good people there would be taken out by Christ, but the bad ones, they just stay behind. But actually, that's not what the letters of Peter say. They say, no, Christ preached in Christ. I don't think preached, you're all damned, you're all condemned, I've just come to give you the good news that you're in hell forever. Probably not. But he preached so that those who had died in the flesh would live in the spirit. And who were those people? Well, actually the text, now this may all be a legend, all right, but it's there, it's in the New Testament. And the text tells you that those people were the people who had died at the time of the great Noah flood. And if you look back at Genesis and say, who were those people? It said they were so utterly corrupt that God just had to drown them. There was nothing else God could think of doing with them. They were just utterly evil, root and branch. So it wasn't just people who tried and failed, it was people who were really evil people, really, really malevolent people. Those are the ones that Christ preached to. Well, as I say, you don't have to believe this, it's just in the New Testament. You have to say, what it shows is the unlimited nature of the love of God. If you're going to be strict about it, set them, well, we can't guarantee from this that everybody will be saved, but what you can guarantee, I think, from these texts is that God will do every possible thing to ensure that every being which is capable of it will be united to God in eternal love. What exactly that would come unto, I don't know, but I think what it means is that after we die, Christ will appear to everyone who dies to preach the gospel of the love of God. And I think what this means is, and I'm now going to quote a 16th century Cardinal Bellarmine, who said, as Catholics, he was talking to Catholics of course, he said, as Catholics we are bound to believe that there is a hell, but we are not bound to believe that there's anybody in it. I think that's a very nice thought. Pope John Paul II said exactly the same thing. He said, I cannot guarantee, he said, that everyone will be saved, but I think we ought to pray for it. And that means we ought to think it's possible. Something worth praying for. And I think certainly other Christians ought to believe this too, because the love of God knows no bounds. The love of God is greater than death. It cannot be limited. Even by death, there is nothing that will limit the love of God. So theosis is a destiny that awaits. So I'm going to bring this to an end to allow for a little bit of discussion here, but I want to suggest this, that when the social Trinitarians with whom I started, love within the being of God, talked about that, that was a moving thing to talk about, but it imperils the monotheistic faith that there is one and only one creator of all things. But what it points to is the thought, which Theosis actually brings out, that God is love. And that if that is true, God is essentially self-giving. That is true. But what that means is that God gives the divine self to things which are not divine. That is, created selves, which have been created to receive the love of God and which need the love of God. See, within the Trinity, nobody needs anything. The three Trinitarian persons, however you interpret them, don't need anything at all. They're all, presumably, omnipotent and omniscient. So there's nothing that one can give to the other. It's as though one omniscient person would say, let me tell you what I've been doing today, and the other two omniscient persons would say, but we already know you're omniscient. So, you might as well not bother. So if you're going to have a real relationship with love, which involves risk, self-giving, real giving, and real receiving, then creation perhaps is essential to a loving God. So that part of the way we might think of God now is a God who is essentially kenotic, self-emptying, and expressive, expressing the divine being in creation, and unitive, taking that creation back into the being of God itself. So the whole cycle of reality is a cycle of proceeding from God, of living its own autonomous life, and then returning through the power of God, because only that can manage it, returning to the being of God itself transformed. And this means that you're going to think of God as a being who, in a sense, is enriched by creation. In this sense, enriched by being able to express a love which otherwise would not have been expressed. And we are going, in our little lives, to add something to the being of God by the good things that we do, which will be treasured in God forever. And in the life beyond this life, I believe that we shall have access to all the good things that have been produced through the rich story of this creation in all whatever worlds there are. And it's a magnificent cosmic story of creation and of divine love. Creating, identifying, and uniting. And that's the Christian gospel, I would have thought. So as far as spirituality and meditation are concerned, it gives you a picture of meditation in this threefold way, modelled on this Trinitarian description of God, of the one beyond, transcendent, beyond concepts, beyond thought, but not beyond acquaintance. The one who is a proper object of love, the beautiful, the good. And the one who known as a power which works within each individual love to take us on the path towards theosis, final participation in the divine being itself.
Food for thought there. I love the idea of us daily even thinking of us being able to enrich the life of God. That's a mind-blowing idea.
Yes. Well, Paul does say, in my own life, I feel like I'm suffering in Christ. Mysterious, though. I'll be very glad to take any questions. I probably only uttered about 10 heresies, I think, in the course of
I have often thought of the very act of creation was an act of kenosis.
Yes.
God did not have to create us. He must have done it, in a sense, giving away something, expressing a need. Otherwise, why are we here?
Yes, I agree. Did everybody hear that? That the act of creation is itself a kenotic, a self-giving act. I think that's true, because the traditional way of thinking of God is that God is supreme perfection. If you read Aristotle, from whom most Christian thinking about God derives, God just loved himself because he was the best thing around. So he loved what was perfect. And God said, I am perfect, and I just love myself. That's great.
Well, can I say something else?
Right?
I've often felt this because I'm thinking about the parable of the vine and its branches. Every preacher tells you that the branches are no use at all without the vine, they're cut off. But I think, wait a minute, the vine is no use without the branches. It is the branches that do what the vine is meant to do, and bears the fruit.
I think that's right.
That idea.
Yeah. I think John's Gospel is theotic throughout. It's all about the unity of divine and human. And I think it's strange that the Christian churches haven't always stressed this. They've talked as though we were just miserable worms and God was somebody who didn't like us very much most of the time. Whereas John's Gospel quite clearly says that, as you just put it now, that Christ is divine, we are the branches. So we're organically and intrinsically united to the divine through Christ. It's a much more positive gospel, isn't it, to say that, rather than to say you're probably going to hell, so unless you do something pretty about it.
Question on personhood.
Personhood, yeah.
Artificial intelligence. Would you baptize a robot?
Sorry?
Would you baptize a robot?
Would I baptize?
A robot, artificial intelligence.
Oh, a robot. Well, if it convinced me that it sincerely believed the creed, yes, I wouldn't have any difficulty. I suppose I would give it the benefit of the doubt. I don't think we're anywhere near that yet, I might say. I haven't baptized by Apple Mac yet. I told you to shut up the other day. Talking to it, yeah. Talking to Siri on the Apple Mac. And I said, shut up. And it said, that's not very nice. Yeah.
I heard it said that here we are and all this will go when we die, but there is at the centre of who we are that which we do not know, which is mystery, which we could call soul, which is known to God and is interacting with God without our conscious knowledge, whereby using all that we are doing to build the part of that which will be left when physically we've gone.
Yeah.
I wonder how that fits with Theosis.
No, that's very well, very good. I mean, when Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talks about the resurrection of the body, he's very clear that the resurrection body is nothing like this. Thank goodness. Though it's causally connected with this body, it will be very different. And the most obvious way to put this is our bodies decay, essentially, that's what they do. Whereas the resurrection body is indestructible. That means if it's indestructible, it can't possibly be part of this universe, because it breaks the fundamental law of entropy, which governs everything in the universe. So it's going to be a different form of existence. Incidentally, that word soul, I'll just put this quickly in. I do agree with what you say, but in traditional Christian thought, the word soul is just equivalent to the word mind. So whatever you think the mind is for a Christian, that's what the soul is. That's the tradition. You don't have to agree with the tradition, but that's what it is. The soul just is the mind. Sometimes people don't know that. So when Aristotle wrote a book called On the Soul, he was talking about the mind. Everybody fully satisfied with everything? Or perhaps you disagree so much it's not worth saying it?
I'm just wondering, when the body dies, the mind dies, but surely the soul doesn't die.
Oh, I reckon the mind dies. I mean, there's the question. If you say when the body dies, the mind dies, I deny that. I would, well, we'll see, won't we? But I would have thought that the mind, that which understands and knows. Just think of a person who loses their memory when they get older. You say, has that mind died? I would say, no, that brain no longer has access to that mind. But that mind is preserved in God, always. And that mind will be re-embodied in a new and incorruptible way by God. I think that's what 1 Corinthians 15 says. I really think the mind does not die. But I hope it will be changed, because I hope we learn more truths and we'll overcome some of the worst bits of our minds and some of the mistakes that we make. So I see the life beyond death as a process of continual learning, an infinite journey into God, as Gregory of Nyssa once put it. And he's a saint, just in case you do. So it must be true.
Critics might say that we're all on this journey, yes, we can be rude about that, but there's not a great deal of evidence that if one looks at the world in general, that we're getting better.
Oh, I don't think as a species we're getting better, no. I think as individuals we're pretty ambiguous creatures, really, but if we think that there is such a thing as divine grace, divine love, and that is capable of changing us, I think that is the best hope for humanity. You would say, well, divine grace has eternity to work, but then you have to say this love is not the end. The mind, equals is always in existence. God holds it in existence. When this body decays, Paul actually says, while this physical body is dying, even while it's dying, the resurrection body, the incorruptible body, is being built up by your actions in the Spirit. And you'll find that in the New Testament. That's a homework. But it's a nice thought. No, well, thank you very much. If you do have any questions, I'm around for a little bit.
Thank you again for your attendance. If there is a basket somewhere lurking at the back, if you wanted to contribute to our expenses. But as I said at the beginning, there will be other things if I'm allowed to contribute. Andrew? It's very invigorating and exhilarating and very happy.
If you like the book of the film, it's called Christ and the Cosmos. and it's in Blackwell's now. It was this morning.